So today's daf is daf Zion. And just to remind ourselves that we were studying the issue of whether or not a korban could possibly be mechaper on an avera that was committed after the hafrosha. Normally, if you violate an avera, then you mafresh a korban. The korban is related to that avera. But what happens if sometime after the hakadasha you already designated the korban and then you violated an avera? And the Gemara was vacillating back and forth and wanted to prove it from the Shnei Seirim of Chag HaShavuos. The purpose of those Seirim is to be mechaper for Tumas Migdash v'Kadosh. If somebody ate Kodshim when he was Tomei inadvertently, or he was Tomei, he inadvertently forgot and went into the Beis HaMikdash, and now why two seirim? Why isn't one sufficient? So the Gemara wanted to suggest that maybe we need a second seir in case he violated something of Tumas Mikdash B'Kadoshav, etc., between one seir and the other. And here's where the Gemara, at the bottom of Daf Vav Amud Beis, introduces a concept, and it's quoted here by Rav Papa, called Leiv Bezdin Masna Lehin. So that even if he was mafresh both Seirim on Erev Shavuos simultaneously, nevertheless, Bezdin could make a Tanai that the second Soyer will not be Chal until a later time. Let's say it won't be Chal until Shavuos itself, such that in case he violates Tumas Mikdash V'Kadoshav between the first Soyer and the second Soyer, let's say during Shavuos itself, then the second Soyer will be Mechaper, and the Gemara is suggesting that the power of the second Soyer to be Mechaper is based on the fact that the Hakdash itself, or the second Soyer, will only take effect after he violated b'shogeg his Tumas Mikdash v'Kadoshav. And even though both hafrashas took place simultaneously on Erev Shavuos, but Rav Papa wants to apply the principle in a case of a korban tzibur that Bezdin is in charge and they have control over the korban tzibur, and therefore they could decide that the hafrasha of the second soyer, which was designated on Erev Shavuos, would not be chal until later on. So the Gemara now has a problem because the brisa that we're dealing with, which Rav Papa is trying to interpret, is Rabbi Shimon. And now the Gemara here on Daf Zion says, L'divrei Rabbi Shimon ein nivdarim tmimim. L'divrei Chacham nivdarim tmimim. Now, this machlokes between Rabbi Shimon and Chachamim has to do with the case of a korban tamid where there was a surplus. They overdid it, and they set aside more animals than they actually needed, so you have a spare tamid. And the question is what to do with that spare tamid, and here's where the Chachamim, not Rabbi Shimon, apply the principle of Leiv Bezdin Masna, such that when they were mafresh the korban tamid, Bezdin made a Tanai, a condition that in event they don't need this tamid, because they'll have enough tamidim to cover the whole year without this tamid, then this particular animal that was designated as a tamid should be what's called kedushas damim rather than kedushas haguf. There's no pigeon in kedushas haguf when it's tmimim, meaning before it falls, a blemish falls. But the Chacham could decide that, you know what, we're going to exercise our powers of Leiv Bezdin Masna, and we're going to make a Tanai that in event we don't need this Tamid, it should only have a limited Kedusha, Kedushas Damim, which lends itself to Pidyon. And even though the animal is a Tamim and it's not blemished, nevertheless you could be Poded. But Rav Shimon, on the other hand, disagrees. And he says, Ein Nivdaim Tmimim. The only way we could solve this problem of the surplus Tamid is if we leave it in the field until it becomes a Balmum. So how could Rav Papa go ahead and interpret that brisa based on the principle of Lev Bezdin Masna Aleim, when that brisa is attributed to Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon himself holds Ein Bezdin Masna Aleim. The Ode, and furthermore, and this is all a kasha that was raised, a double-barreled kasha by Rav Yosef against Rav Papa. And Rav Yosef now adds another important point here, and he says, you cannot talk about the second sorrow of Shavuos and assume that it could be mechaper only on violations of Tumas Migdash v'Kadoshav before the Hafrasha. Haboy minei Rab Yirmiyah mirab Zera se'iri atzera shekibel domom b'shnei kosos. It means that he was mafresh two seirim for, in this case, Shavuos, and the hakrova of both of them took place simultaneously, so that the Kabbalas Hadam was pretty much simultaneous. He was makabel the dam of one of the seirim in one receptacle, that's called a kos, and the dam of the second soyer in a second kos. And then he went ahead after he was makabel the dam of, we'll call it Sa'ir number 1, and then he was makabel the dam of Sa'ir number 2. Nizrak domo shel Rishon. And Rabbi Yirmiyah says, if you are already zorek the dam of the Rishon, then Sheni Lama Ba. What does he need a second Zrikas dam on the second soil? What's it going to accomplish? Al Tuma She'ira Ben Zrika Shel Zeh Lo Zeh. The only way we could justify the second Zrika, which means the Avodas HaKapara of the second Sawyer, is if we assume that somehow in that very short period of time between the Zrika of the first Sawyer and the Zrika of the second Sawyer, he violated Tuma, again B'Shogeg. So now Rav Yosef is going to be medayek from the way that Rav Yirmiyah formulated his question of Sheni Lamahu Ba, Ad kan lo mi boile ela asay deliachar shchita. He's only asking about the violation of an asay, and here we have to mention that a tame is not only enjoined with a lotasa from entering into the mikdash, but there's also an asay that the Torah commands the tame to leave the environments of the mikdash. For example, in a case where he contracted tumah while he was already in the mikdash. And now Rabbi Yirmiyah is wondering, what about a violation of an asay after shchita, meaning between the zrikas domim of the first sire and the second? So it was after shchita. Aval asay deliachar afrosha lo kami boile. But it means that Rabbi Yirmiyah never even raised the possibility or the question regarding the violation of an essay after the hafrosha. That he didn't ask. No, he assumed that for sure there would be a kapara for any violation of an essay after the hafrasha, and therefore you cannot say that Reb Shimon's statement in the Brisa refers to violations committed between the two hafrashos. That's for sure not true. He was only asking about a case of liachar shchita, but as far as liachar hafrasha is concerned, he took it for granted that the korban is mechaper for those violations of esim after the hafrasha. So the Gemara is not so bothered by the second objection of Rav Yosef. Dilma, perhaps you could say im timtzaloma ka'omar. Really what Rabbi Yirmiyah was saying was that if you come to the conclusion that the korban could be mechaper for averos even after the hafrasha, that were committed even after the hafrasha, could it also be mechaper for violations after the shechita? But Rabbi Yirmiyah was never certain about that. He was never sure about it. And now the Gemara goes on, Itmar, Toda sheshchata l'shem todas chavero, machlokes here between Rabbah and Rav Chisda. What happens if Ruvain has to bring a korban toda, and he was mafresh a carbon toda. Comes along the Kohen, and he shechts it with the mindset that he wants this carbon toda to be oleh for Shimon, not for Reuven. So Rava says kshera, which means that the carbon is still kosher, even though we say that Shini Bailim is a posel in karbonos. It means this is not considered shinui. Why? Because it's all within the realm of carbon toda. It's just from one carbon toda to another carbon toda. It's not like he had in mind a carbon toda l'shem shlomim, which would passel the carbon. Rav Chizda Amar Psula. Rav Chizda says, no, the owner of the carbon, that means Ruvain, will have to bring a second carbon because it's lo ola le shem chovasa. And why is it? Because this is like a whole different kind of carbon. Because the carbon toda, I hope I said carbon toda before, I'm not sure. Anyway, the carbon toda is generated by any one of four hatzolos. And each hatzola obligates a different kind of carbon toda. So that if Reuven, for example, is bringing a carbon toda because he got freed from jail, and Shimon is bringing a carbon toda because he was desperately ill and now he is better, he's recovered, those two carbonos toda are considered like two separate carbonos. And therefore, when the Kohen, has in mind for Shimon and not for Reuven, the owner of the carbon toda, then it's like Shinui Kodesh. It's as if he was bringing it for a whole different carbon. And therefore, Rav Chizda says it's possible. Rab Homer Ksherili Gemara analyzes this. Toda l'shem toda nishchita. At the end of the day, Shimon had a chiyuv toda, so that when the Kohen has in mind in the shchita of Todas Reuven for the sake of Shimon, he has in mind another carbon toda, there's no shini kodesh. Rav Chizda Rav Psula l'shum shlamim didei be'inon. What does it mean? According to Rav Chizda, each one of these karbanos shlamim is like of karbanos toda is like a different kind of a carbon. It's almost like vis-a-vis the carbon toda of Reuven, the carbon toda of Shimon is like a carbon shlamim, which is a totally different carbon, and the shini kodesh, because if the shchita or any of the avodos of a carbon toda was done l'shem shlamim, then in fact the carbon is possible. And this, by the way, we derive from a pasuk in Vayikra Perek Zayin. It says there, Besar Zevach Toda Shlomov. And it says Shlomov in the possessive, not Shlomim, but Shlomov, which means that the Toda has to be shechted for the owner, Shlomov, his carbon Toda, but not for the carbon Toda of another person of Shimon. Amar Rabba Mina Amila. I'm going to prove to you my position, my ruling, based on a brisa. The Sanya we learned in the brisa, ubisar zevach toda shlomov biyom hakrivo es zivcho. And I'm going to quote to you the interpretation of this pasuk, the derivation thereof, from one of the Tanoim in the brisa, Abba Chanin Omer Shum Rabbi Eliezer, Bol Lamed. If you're makriv a carbon tamid for the purpose of a shlomim, it's kshera. Why? Because a carbon toda is included under, it's a branch of the greater carbon, which is the carbon shlomim. So in effect, if you recall Shimon Azariah in the Mishnah at the beginning of Zevachim, it's ole legavoa mimena, because shlomim is that much greater than a carbon toda. However, shlomim shenishchu l'shem toda, if he shechts the shlomim to a lower level, which is toda, because toda is namuch shebahen, is psulin. Uma hefresh bein zel lezeh. How do you differentiate between these two situations? Toda kruya shlom, vein shlom kruya toda. Toda is a subcategory of shlamim. Shlamim is a greater, all-inclusive category, and therefore, if he shechted the Talmud l'shem shlamim, it's within the category of the greater shlamim. But ein shlamim kuruyim toda. And now Rab explains his proof. Shlamim l'shem toda psula. Let's be medayik in the language of the Brisa. The Brisa says that the reason why this carbon is possible is because it was shlamim, and shlamim, if it was makriv it l'shem toda, is possible. The implication is toda l'shem toda kshera, my lav de chavre. In other words, the Brisa wanted to exclude a case. Could have told me a bigger chiddush. Even toda l'shem toda is possible. In what case would toda l'shem toda be possible? In the case where instead of bringing the carbon and doing the avoda for the purpose of Ruvain's toda, they brought it for the purpose of Shimon's toda. And yet, the Brisa seems to imply that in that case it would be kshera. It's only possible because it was a shlamim l'shem toda, but not toda l'shem toda. Lo, the Gemara rejects it. Didei. The word didei means his own carbon toda. And the teaching is talking about an individual Ruvain. There's no Shimon in the picture. And Ruvain has two reasons, two mechayvim, for which he's chayav a toda. Which might mean that, let's say, he crossed the sea and he designated a carbon toda, and then he got out of jail and he designated the same carbon toda, trying to kill two birds with one stone. And let's say the shechita was done on the hatzola of Yordei Hayam, but his intention was that it should serve as a carbon toda for Yatsa Beis Hasurim. And in such a case, what happens? This carbon is going to be kosher. And why is it kosher? Because it's not one toda of Ruvain for the sake of another toda of Shimon, but rather it's one toda of Ruvain for the sake of Ruvain's other chiyuv toda. So it's all in the same. But in the case where Ruvain's toda was brought by the Kohen for the sake of Shimon's toda, that would be considered a Shinu Kodesh, and it would be possible. And that's how the Gemara rejects the proof of Rabbah in order to support Rav Chisda. Rabbah is not totally TKO'd over here. He's still in the ring. He says, my psula, you're going to tell me that the Brisa is implying that if the Hakrova was done of Ruvain's toda for the sake of Shimon, it's invalid. And that's exactly what Rav Chisda says. Is now we have something like, what's it called? Liflog v'lisnei b'dida, meaning tell me the greater chiddush. Adatani shlovim l'shem toda psula. Why not tell me a bigger chiddush? Listen to toda l'shem toda. V'kolshkein shlovim l'shem toda. I mean, okay, shlovim l'shem toda we understand is a shinu kodesh and it's possible. But tell me a bigger chiddush that even toda l'shem toda, just as one was for Reuven, one was for Shimon, that's also possible. And that's going to be an objection against Rav Chisda. So the Gemara says, no, Rav Chisda is not bothered by this because Shlomim l'shem toda didei itzrichle. The Brisa wants to tell me a big chiddush here, that if he was makriv a carbon shlomim for his own toda, and since toda is part of the general matrix of shlomim, and this Ruvain is chayav in a carbon toda, so when he shechted a shlomim l'shem toda, he's really doing himself a favor, and it's really should be ola l'carbon. Salka dait kamina midid toda kruya shlomim shlom nami kruya toda. Why can't you say that shlomim is also included under toda? Is it a one-way street? And therefore, if he shechted a shlomim l'shem toda, it should be kosher kamash malon. Omar Rav. Okay, now we really start today's daf. with a whole series of statements of Rava, and some of them seem to contradict one to the other, and we have to reconcile them. I'm always flabbergasted by Gemaras like this because Rava, the Gemara says, died at the age of 40. And wherever you turn, on any page of the Gemara, Rava, Rava, Rava. This is no exception. Oh, my Rava. And again, we're talking about Shidi Kodesh. Chatos eshchata l'shem chatos, kshera l'shem ola psula. Let's say, for example, he ate chelev b'shogeg and he ate dam b'shogeg. And he's bringing this karban chatos, which was designated for the avera of chelev, and he has in mind that the shechita should be for the sake of dam, ksher. It's all in the same family. However, l'shem ola, if he shechs a chatos l'shem ola psula, that's what we saw already in our Mishnah, that shalol lishma in the case of chatos and in Pesach is possible. My timer, v'shachat osa lechatas omer achmona. Harei chatos l'shem chatos nishchita. The Torah is only saying that the avoda should be done l'shem chatos. Doesn't say that it has to be done l'shem chatos of this chait as opposed to another chait. At the end of the day, he had in mind a chatos. But l'shem ola psula, because that's not v'shachat osa lechatas, l'shem chatas. That's statement number one of Rav. V'yomar Rav is statement number two. Chatos sheshchata al misha mechuyev chatos. Now, by way of introduction, we had, if you recall, just to jolt your memory, a sugya about whether minah machriv or lav minah machriv. And to some extent, the Gemara's conclusion was that mina machriv ba, but shalol mina eno machriv ba. Like, for example, just to recall, let's say a korban was brought for a yoledes who was an akum, she was non-Jewish. So that machshava of l'shem akum is lav mina, that's from another world, and it doesn't register. So here also, Rav is going to use that kind of logic and say the following. If it was a chatos for the sake of someone else's chatos, then it's psula, because that's already min b'mino machriv ba. But al misha b'chuyev ola doesn't register on the Richter scale of chatos. It's totally out of the league, out of the orbit. And therefore kshera, which would mean that min b'she'edo mino lo machriv ba. My timer, but where does Rava derive this conclusion? From the chiper olav. Now, what does the word olav mean? It seems like it's a superficial, a superfluous word. V'lo al chavero. Okay, fine. V'lo al chavero, which means that you cannot have in mind in a korban of Ruvain for the sake of Shimon. And that would seem to indicate that even if Shimon has a chiyuv ola, whereas Ruvain was bringing a korban chatas, you should probably say that it's possible. And yet Rava said that al misha mechuyev ola kshera. Zakti Gemara chavero dumya didei b'mechuyev kapar kamoso. When does the Torah say that you should be mechaper olav, and it's got to be olav, meaning v'lo al chavero, otherwise it's possible if he has in mind chavero? That's in a case of dumya didei. In other words, the pasuk says olav for his chiyuv, and not for the chiyuv of someone else who's dumya didei, who's similar to himself. And that means that Shimon has, like Ruvain, a chiyuv chatas. And the Torah is saying that, no, the keeper olav, it's got to be olav al chavero. And therefore, if you have in mind the chatas of Shimon, it's possible. However, if it's not mechuyev kapar kamoso, if let's say Shimon is chayiv in a korban ola, as we said before, that's min b'sheino mino, is lo machriv ba, it doesn't pass the korban. Third statement of Rava. Omar Rava, chata sheshchata al misha eino mechuyev klum. Now, in this case, this reminds you of the sugi that we had the other day about shachat l'shem chulin, and we said that l'shem chulin is kosher. Here also, he's shechting it for someone who has no obligation of any karba whatsoever, and yet Rava says psula. So Rava must be holding that even though Shimon was not mechuyev carbon, nevertheless, a carbon for Shimon, even though he's not mechuyev, is meaningful. It's mechaper for Shimon. And why is that so? I mean, Shimon's not mechuyev carbon. How can you say that the carbon is mechaper? She'elecha adam b'Yisrael she'ena mechuyev esei. Everyone, says Rav, at some point or another, is guilty of non-fulfillment of an essay, and he needs kapar for that. And for example, a korban ola, as we learned back on Daf Hey, will be mechaper for that bittul essay. He didn't take a lulav, or he didn't sit in sukkah. So now Rav is saying that if the shechita of this chatas was on behalf of Shimon, then Shimon is chayav in a kapara, because no doubt that Shimon, like all of us, violated at some point an essay and needs kapara for the essay. So the fact, this is really like shechting a carbon for an entire different carbon, and therefore the carbon is possible. But now we have to ask another question. We said before that according to Rav, there's got to be dumya de chavre, or chavre dumya di de. Now, Reuven is bringing a carbon chatas. It means he violated a chiyuv kares b'shogeg, like chelev or dam. Now you're telling me that Shimon's chiyuv is for an essay. Well, guess what? If it's for an essay, that's not considered dumya di de. So the Gemara adds, Omar Rava chatos mechaperes al chayve essay, that when a man brings a carbon chatos for violating a chiyuv lav sheyesh bo kares, he's also being mechaper for his iser essay. It's also included and based on the following kal v'chomer. Is chatos al chayve krisus mechaperes al chayve essay lo kolshken. If the power of chatos is to effectuate an atonement for a violation of the most serious nature, a chiyuv kares, then how much more so does that chatos have the power to generate atonement for an essay, for a non-fulfillment of an essay? Again, I don't know if the Gemara has in mind bris milah and carbon pesach, because that's an essay sheyesh bo kares. So let's limit ourselves to a regular essay. Let's say he didn't wear tzitzis on a beged of Dalit Kanfis, or he didn't put on tefillin, and the carbon chatos will be mechaper not only for the chelev or the dam that he ate b'shogeg, but even for the tzitzis that he didn't put on, or the tefillin that he didn't put on, based on the kal v'chomer. So since the chatos has within it a kapara even for an essay based on this kal v'chomer, then if Shimon, even though he's not chayav a carbon because he never violated chelev or dam sheish bo kares, but he's definitely included in Klal Yisrael that are guilty of an essay, so therefore he is also subject to a kapara, and that kapara is dumya di day. Why? Because the Ruvain's carbon chatos is a kapara for an essay based on the kal v'chomer, and Shimon's kapara will also be on an essay, and therefore they're on the same level. And if they're on the same level, we go back to Rava's statement that chatos sheshachta al misha mechuyev chatos psula, because it's dumya di day. So the Gemara asks, wait a minute, lemeimer de bas minahi? Are you going to tell me that just because a carbon ola of Shimon would be mechaper on a violation of an essay, therefore it's considered to be mina And Dumya di day when Reuven is chayiv in a chatos. Amar Rav, what are you going to do with another statement of Rav? This is, I think, number 4. Chatos sheshchata al misha mechuyev chatos psula al misha mechuyev ola kshera. You're worried about the fact that Shimon has violated an essay, and therefore being makriv and ola for Shimon is a meaningful mechaper for the avera of bittul essay of Shimon. But 1 second, Rava himself said that if Reuven is chayiv achatos, they brought the carbon on behalf of Shimon who's chayiv and ola. Guess what? The carbon is kosher. Now, you and I might have said that that's not such an objection because Reuven's chatos also includes within it an ola. But the Gemara doesn't say that. The Gemara is assuming that even though Rava says that the chatos of Reuven could be mechaper on an essay, but nevertheless, it still remains a carbon chatos. And Shimon, who needs kapara for an essay, that's a carbon ola. And Rav is on record as saying that chatos sheshchata l'shem ola for someone else's ola is kshera. So just to summarize, before we turn to Daf Zayin and Beis, we have a stira now between 2 statements of Rava. On the one hand, Rava says that chatos sheshchata al misha eina mechuyev klum psula, which means that it's a chatos for Shimon's ola, and yet Rav himself went on record as saying that chatos sheshchachta al misha mechuyev ola kshera.